The NBA has been around for about 75 years at this point. Throughout this time, we've seen a lot of good, great, and legendary teams assembled. We've seen the rise of several dynasties and countless NBA champions. But the real question is, how do these infinite amount of teams over the NBA's history stack up against each other? It's really tough to rank these all-time great teams against each other. I mean, where do we even start? But instead of ranking these teams in numerical order, one right next to the other, what better way to rank these teams than in a pyramid style? If you're watching this video, I'm sure you've heard of this concept. I'm sure you've seen these around. But for those who haven't, a pyramid style ranking allows you to give a certain tier level of different teams in our case that are around each other's skill level. It starts with tier 1 at the top, the best of the best, tier 2 being the second best level of teams, and so on for 5 different tiers. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at tier 4 and 5 of the pyramid. Before we start here, I want to inform you guys about some of the rules of choosing teams and some decision methods we're going to be using today. The golden rule of this pyramid that can't be broken under any circumstances is that a team must win a championship to even have a shot at being on this list. The pyramid is ranking teams year by year, not just ranking dynasties, so spoiler alert, you're gonna see multiple Jordan, LeBron, Curry, Magic, and Kobe teams on here. Next off, the pyramid can include any team from 1960 until the present day, so no teams from the 50s and 40s, just based off how different the game was back then. The pyramid consists of 5 tiers, like we mentioned before, 10 teams in tier 5, 8 teams in tier 4, 6 teams in tier 3, 4 teams in tier 2, and 2 teams in tier 1. And now you may be asking yourself, how in the living hell are you going to properly rank 30 of the 64 champions on a pyramid without making any huge errors? Well, I'm going to be making most of my decisions based off the stats I found in the video I made way back in March of 2023 titled, I found the best team using just stats. In this video, I used 9 important stats to guide myself to a conclusion. Regular season record, SRS score, which is margin of victory plus strength of schedule, margin of victory, offensive rating, defensive rating, true shooting percentage, playoff record, playoff competition based off SRS scores of opponents, and playoff net rating. So both regular season and playoff success will be accounted for, and these numbers are still extremely relevant to use today. So to come to a concrete and objective ranking, the majority of my decisions made on this pyramid are going to be guided by these stats. So let's get started with tier 5. The first team we have in tier 5 is the 1963 and 64 Boston Celtics. For every team that appears in this pyramid, I'm going to be showing you guys kind of like a grading report that shows these 9 crucial stats compared to the other 63 champions in NBA history. So anyways, the Boston Celtics' biggest strength here, by far, being their defensive rating, placing first all time. No one outdoes them in defense. But their biggest flaw being their offense, placing 63rd in both true shooting percentage and offensive rating. The team was a defensive powerhouse, led by none other than Bill Russell, who averaged 15 points and 25 rebounds a game, and John Havlicek and Sam Jones, who both averaged a hair under 20 points. This team went 59-21 in the regular season, beat the Cincinnati Royals with Oscar Robertson 4-1 in the Eastern Division Finals, and beat the San Francisco Warriors in the finals with Wilt Chamberlain. The next team we have in tier 5 is surprisingly the 2017 and 18 Warriors. Now, I know what you're thinking. This team should be way higher than tier 5. They had Steph, Clay, Draymond, and KD, but this year's version of the squad wasn't nearly as dominant as the previous year. The team's biggest strength was by far their offense, placing first at true shooting percentage and placing 10th in offensive rating, and their playoff net rating where they placed 8th at. But everything else, especially defense, was a weakness for this team compared to all of the NBA champions in history, of course. Their defense wasn't great compared to the rest of the list. They had a very high 107.6 defensive rating, which placed them 3rd last all time. The Warriors in 2018 finished with a 58-24 record, beating the Spurs in the first round, Pelicans in the second round, beating the James Harden-led Rockets in the conference finals, and they swept the Cavs with LeBron in the finals. Speaking of LeBron, the next team we have is the 2015 and 16 Cavs. The Cavs are definitely one of the more memorable teams to ever win a ring, being the only team to come back from a 3-1 deficit in the finals. But besides this Cavs team wasn't really all that compared historically. The biggest strength of this Cavs team was their unreal playoff run, placing top 10 in playoff competition and having a top 10 net rating of all time in the playoffs, while having an impressive 16-5 postseason record. and you could talk about their above average offense. The regular season for them was average at best, which, just like the playoffs, is a big factor in ranking these teams. The next team we have is the 1999 and 2000 Lakers. This team was the first championship that Kobe and Shaq got together. The team was an absolute beast in the regular season. They finished with a record of 67-15, which ranks them 7th all-time in championship teams. The Lakers of 2000 also had one of the best margin of victory in SRS scores. The Lakers this year placed in the top 15 in both of these stats, with a margin of victory of 8.55 and an SRS of 8.41. What keeps this team down from a higher ranking is their lack of dominance in the playoffs compared to other historic teams. I mean, don't get me wrong, any team who wins a championship is a dominant team, but the margin is so thin for historic teams. The Lakers had a playoff run of 15-8, which is kind of weak. And we're not done talking about the Lakers yet, because the next team on here is the 2002 Lakers, another Kobe and Shaq team. The Lakers in 2002 swept the Blazers in the first round, beat the Spurs in round 2 4-1, beat the Kings in 7 games in the conference finals, and swept the New Jersey Nets in the finals. The Lakers in 2002 didn't do anything remarkable, well, at least in the regular season. Looking at the stats, the team was average at best, historically compared in the regular season. Don't get me wrong, of course they were an extremely dominant team in the regular season, just like every other future champion was. But the gap in between each team is so thin that it takes a once-in-a-generation season to even stand out. What also helps the Lakers was their impressive 15-4 record in the playoffs while playing against the 6th hardest competition statistically. Our next team might surprise you here. It's actually the 1992 and 93 Chicago Bulls. This one might be confusing, seeing one of MJ's best teams of all time being only at tier 5, but they deserve to be here. Capping off the Bulls' first three-peat, they had the notorious MJ and Pippen duo alongside with Horace Grant and BJ Armstrong. The biggest strength of this team is either their offense with a rating of 13th all-time or their playoff dominance with all 3 stats placing above average. They had a regular season record of 57-25 where they swept the Hawks in the first round, swept the Cavs in the second round, beat the Ewing-led Knicks in 6 games, and beat the Charles Barkley Suns in 6 games in the finals. The next team we have on here is the 1979 and 80 Lakers. The 1980 Lakers represents Magic Johnson's rookie year, where he won the Finals MVP against the 76ers. With a regular season record of 60-22, they cruised through the first 2 conference playoff rounds, beating both the Suns and the Supersonics in 5 games, and they beat the 76ers in 6 games in the finals. In Game 6 of the finals, Kareem was hurt, so Magic took it upon himself to lead the Lakers to a championship. When looking at the 1979 and 80 Lakers stats, the only thing that really jumps out at you is their efficiency, which is placed 13th all time. Otherwise, there's nothing too stand out about this team. Just a consistent team that got the job done. As you can see, it doesn't take a perfect season to make tier 5. I mean, after all, these 10 teams represent the 21st to 31st best champions ever. The next team we have on here is the 1980 and 81 Celtics. This team was Larry Bird's sophomore campaign in the league, which he led his Celtics to a championship and got himself his very first ring. This championship was a huge revival for winning basketball in Boston. In terms of stats, the number one strength you could say about this team historically was the regular season record of 62-20, but nothing else really stands out about them. Once again, the margin becomes so thin once you're only talking about champions that even a super dominant team like the 1981 Celtics, who were solid in all areas, kind of get lost in the bunches, placing around the middle in many of these categories. The final 2 teams in Tier 5 are both Duncan-led Spurs teams, the 1999 Spurs and the 2005 Spurs. We're going to start with the 2005 Spurs. This championship was Tim Duncan's 3rd ring and Tony Parker's 2nd ring. Duncan averaged a staggering 20 points, 11 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks a game. This team was fairly consistent in most areas of the game. One of their best areas was defense, where they had a defensive rating of 98.8, which led the league in 2005, and placed them somewhat high all time. You could also talk about their SRS score, which was 7.84. This team had a record of 59-23 in the regular season. In the playoffs, they beat the Nuggets in 5 games, then they beat the Seattle Supersonics in 6 games, then they beat the Suns in 5 games, and beat the Ben Wallace-led Pistons in the finals. And the final team we have here is the 1999 Spurs, where the Twin Towers duo was at their peak performance, with Tim Duncan and David Robinson. The Spurs, right before the turn of the century, were a very solid team. Sophomore Tim Duncan averaged 21 points, 11 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks. The spot where this team shines the brightest is on defense, where they placed top 15 all-time in defensive rating with a score of only 95. Another area where they excel is playoff performance. They had a very impressive 15-2 playoff record, ranking them 6th all-time. In 1999, they beat the T-Wolves in 4 games, swept the Kobe Bryant and Shaq Lakers, swept the Blazers, and beat the Knicks in 5 games in the finals. And they had a net rating in the playoffs of 8.4, ranking them 13th all-time. And that wraps up Tier 5. Now on to Tier 4. Tier 4 represents the 13th to 20th best NBA champions ever, so really good teams. So the first team that makes up Tier 4 of the pyramid is the 1966 and 67 76ers. This team was primarily led through Wilt Chamberlain, who averaged 24 points and 24 rebounds to beat the San Francisco Warriors in the finals. They also had other players like Hall Greer and Chet Walker, who made solid contributions. This was a very solid squad. They finished with a record of 68-13, the 4th best record of any NBA champion ever. They also placed very well in SRS at 11th place and margin of victory at 9th place, beating teams by more than 9 points a game on average. And they were also a great defensive unit with a defensive rating of 93.9, which places them 14th all time. In terms of their playoff run, there isn't anything special about it historically, but they're still good enough to place in Tier 4. The next team we're going to talk about is the 1997-98 Chicago Bulls. This team was Michael Jordan's final season with the Bulls. Despite the team getting old, they were still able to notch up a historic season. The offense from this team was definitely starting to fade, as Michael Jordan's flair on offense was starting to diminish, and Pippen was also aging. However, this team was still able to keep their defensive integrity they built through the previous 5 championships. In the playoffs, they had an impressive record of 15-6 and a net rating of 8.2. They swept the New Jersey Nets in the first round, beat the Hornets 4-1, beat the Reggie Miller Pacers 3-1, and beat the Utah Jazz in the finals 4-2. Moving on here, let's talk about the 2006 and 2007 San Antonio Spurs. This team was led by none other than Tim Duncan, who averaged 22 points, 11 rebounds, and 3 blocks a game in the playoffs. They also had other contributors like Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Bruce Bowen. They beat the Cleveland Cavs with the young LeBron in the finals 4-0. Historically speaking, there's not a lot that stands out about this team, but there's nothing that really drags them down. They were second in defensive rating in the NBA in 2007, which ranks them 26th all time. Their SRS score was impressive at 8.35, ranking them 14th all time. Another strength of them was their postseason record at 16-4, just a solid overall squad. The 4th team in Tier 4 is the 2008-9 Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers in 2009 were led by the Kobe Bryant and Pau Gasol duo. This was Kobe's first ring without anyone named Shaquille O'Neal on the roster. They beat the Orlando Magic with Dwight Howard in the finals 4-1. Kobe averaged 27, 5, and 5, and Pau Gasol averaged 19 points and 9 rebounds a game. The 2009 Lakers had a record of 65 and 17, which places them at a healthy 15th of all time. Their biggest strength was their electrifying offense with Kobe and Pau, placing 14th all time in offensive rating and 25th in true shooting, and their playoff net rating was very solid at 7.9. The next team we have in Tier 4 is the Bad Boy Pistons from 1988 to 1989. The Bad Boy Pistons were the villains of the league, the team that people like to talk about when they talk about physical basketball from the 80s. This team was led by point guard Isaiah Thomas, but was supported from Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, Dennis Rodman, and Rick Mahorn. Despite placing 48th all-time in defense, this team was known as a defensive powerhouse. Besides their regular season record being a phenomenal 63-19, their playoff record was even better at 15-2, placing 4th all-time while beating teams by 8.7 points per 100 possessions. They swept the Celtics in the first round, swept the Bucks in the second round, beat the Jordan Bulls 4-2 in the conference finals, and beat the Lakers in the finals 4-0. Our next team we're going to talk about is the Big Three Celtics in 2008. This team is pretty well known as the only championship the Celtics have won in about the last 36 years. This team showed the world that at the time you could sign your way to a championship, signing Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett that same offseason. This team finished with a regular season record of 66-16, and they beat the Los Angeles Lakers in the finals. The Celtics in 2008 had a very impressive SRS score of 9.3, which places 8th all-time, and 7th all-time in margin of victory at 10.26. They also managed to lead the NBA in 2008 in defensive rating, which Kevin Garnett played a huge part in, being the defensive anchor of the team. The only thing that brings down their extraordinary regular season was their weaker playoff run. Of course, a ring is a ring, but they went to 7 games in both the first and second rounds and lost 10 total games in the playoffs. And on top of that, their competition wasn't phenomenal, and many of these games were fairly close. The second to last team in Tier 4 is the 1984 and 85 Lakers. This team was right in the middle of the Showtime Lakers dynasty. The Lakers by this time had perfected the offensive brilliance this highlight-producing team was capable of. The duo of Magic Johnson and Kareem was a lethal force, along with James Worthy, Byron Scott, Michael Cooper, and an old Bob McAdoo. This championship was Magic's 3rd ring and Kareem's 4th ring. Like we talked about their offense before, this team placed in the top 10 all-time in offensive rating and placed top 5 in true shooting percentage. In the playoffs, this team had a record of 15-4 and a net rating of 9.4. They swept the Suns in the first round, beat the Clyde Drexler Blazers 4-1, beat the Alex English Nuggets 4-1, and beat the Celtics in the finals 4-2. And the final team that makes up Tier 4 is the 2012 and 13 Miami Heat. The Heatles with LeBron, D-Wade, and Chris Bosh. This year was the trio's second championship won together, where they beat the Bucks, Derrick Rose Bulls, and Paul George Pacers in the conference rounds, and beat the old head Spurs with Kawhi Leonard in the finals. Looking at the stats, this team's biggest strength was first off their record of 66-16, very impressive. What also stands out about this team was their incredible offense, placing 16th at offensive rating and 6th at true shooting percentage. The chemistry that these 3 players had on offense was unmatched. And that about wraps up Tier 4 and Part 1 of the pyramid. If you have any suggestions or recommendations for the pyramid, let me know down in the comments. Be sure to stay tuned for Part 2 of the pyramid, where we're going to go over Tiers 3, 2, and 1.